thank you very much everyone for joining us today. This is part of the CST, the Centre for Complex Systems in Transition, is a interdisciplinary research and practice centre, or we hope to do research, or we claim to do research, and we aim to do research that's not just for academia, but also to inform the world or kind of practice around us and to bring about change. And in this field of sustainability research, that's become more important than ever. And in this webinar series, we're trying to sort of share work that local South African colleagues are doing and how that's impacting our context, but also how we're making connections in the world and how that's influencing the kinds of work that we're doing. So thank you for joining us for today. From now on, we'll be doing these webinars every first and third Thursday until the end of the year. So if you have a regular Thursday lunchtime time, every second Thursday from now on, we'll be online and we'll be sharing some work of colleagues. And today's focus will be on work that some of the colleagues at the CST, in collaboration with their colleague Philile Mbatha from UCT, has done, but also this is part of a much larger work and network globally. The theme is a roadmap to redefine humanity's relationship with the ocean. And our panelists today are Professor Mark Swilling, who's the co-director of the CST, Tanya, Brodie, who's a collaborator on this project and the lead from this side, who's an environmental lawyer, and then Dr. Philile Mbatha, who's a lecturer at Environmental and Geographical Science Department at UCT. I'll just ask each of our participants to briefly introduce themselves, just say where you are or what the focus of your current work is, and then we'll start off with Tanya introducing the project.
Hi, my name is Tanya Brodie Rudolph. As Rika has said, I am a researcher at the Centre for Complex Systems in Transition, and also I run a marine and environmental law advisory in a sustainability consultancy. In the early part of my career, I was more involved in the financial market law sector and commercial law, and I lectured for a while at the University of Johannesburg in the law of negotiable instruments. I then shifted more towards marine and environmental law and was involved in infrastructure development of the oil and gas industry in South Africa. My more recent work has been looking at bigger picture policy overviews and looking at sustainability solutions. And what really interests me about law is how it can evolve and shift to reflect changing norms in society and the creative process in thinking about how law can reflect change. This recent work I came to be involved with through a meeting with Mark Swilling at the Sustainability Institute. We chatted about our work and realized that there was a lot of common ground between us, and Mark invited me to participate with the high-level panel for the ocean paper. And we've had a year of collaboration with amazing authors from around the world and some very exciting research, which we are looking forward to sharing with you today.
Thank you. Philile.
Hello, everyone. My name is Philile Mbatha, and I work at the Environmental and Geographical Science Department at UCT, as been introduced. A lot of my work focuses on issues of governance and livelihoods related to the coast and marine environment. So I've done a lot of work looking at protected areas along the coast of South Africa, and I've done some work in Mozambique as well as Southeast Asia, looking at issues affecting coastal governance and how that trickles down to livelihoods. I'm also interested in issues of legal pluralism along the coast, so where there's more than one governance structure that is in place to basically govern the use and access of marine resources. And currently I'm working in a large transdisciplinary project called the One Ocean Hub, and I'm involved in work looking at the interface between small-scale fisheries and recreational fisheries. And I'm also involved in work looking at the critical perspectives of the blue economy and how that's being adopted in South Africa and what's coming out of it. Yeah, so I'm really excited to share the work from the paper and also just my other work here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing. Mark.
Thanks, Rika, and thanks, colleagues. As Rika said, I'm the co-director of the CST. My core research at the moment is really around energy transitions. And recently I published a book called The Age of Sustainability, Just Transitions in a Complex World. I got drawn into this work on the ocean, which I've never ever worked on before. I'm not part of the gigantic kind of ocean community of researchers, but I got drawn in mainly because of my work with the International Resource Panel on transitions, which is a UNEP-convened panel that looks at material flows. And one of the issues that we have addressed there is oceans. But this high-level panel needed an input on transition. How do we think about transitions with regard to any issues, but in particular in this case, oceans. So it's all very well for natural scientists to document the problem, but one also needs social scientists who could think about institutional and governance and relational change. So that's where hopefully social scientists have a small role to play in this bigger sustainability story, which tends to be led by natural scientists.
Great. Yeah, an important point to make, that these things are often combinations not only of different countries around the globe and disciplines, but it's also, different aspects and facets of research that come together in these projects. Thank you very much. I'm going to just ask Tanya to just start the discussion on sharing the work that you've done and what the findings are that came out in this paper that you published in Nature Communications, which is part of a broader engagement with colleagues overseas. So, yeah.
Thank you. In order to create some context for our conversation about why we need a new relationship between humanity and the ocean, I just wanted to talk briefly about the ocean and the role it plays in our lives. So it's been unequivocally demonstrated that the ocean's linked to climate. We know that 50% of the oxygen that we breathe comes from the ocean. It absorbs 25% of the CO2 emissions that we emit and 90% of the heat from those emissions. It houses 50% to 80% of life on Earth and provides food for 3 billion people. We're also all aware of the pressures facing the ocean. Biodiversity loss has been ranked as one of the top risks facing humanity in the next 10 years. The ocean levels are rising, oceans are warming, overfishing has caused depletion of fish stocks, and plastics feature in the news every day. And scientists are warning that we are reaching tipping points which could actually terminate these biophysical functions of the ocean. And COVID's demonstrated to us recently just how interconnected we are with nature and our well-being. So it's more important now than ever that we understand complex systems and how to govern them and how to transition through them. So in our paper, we look at transition theory and overlay that on ocean governance, and we show how ocean systems are already adapting to these pressures and shifting towards a more sustainable use of natural resources. And this is happening through really interesting innovations that are emerging in the ocean space. These innovations can catalyze inter-transition and cause shifts in the same way as local renewable energy systems have transitioned into and overtaken fossil fuel systems. So our starting point for governance was to look at the absolute intuitive understanding that we all have, and that is that the ocean is a unified whole. It's an incredibly complex and highly interrelated system with cycles of climate, biodiversity, energy, and human activities that move through ocean spaces in national waters and international waters without regard to boundaries that we superimpose as humans. So really the ocean should be thought of as a commons in much the same way as the atmosphere is. This simultaneous complexity and unity represents a real challenge for governance. Governance has evolved in a fragmented, piecemeal way over time to deal with sectors like shipping or fishing or mining, also to provide governance in spaces like ocean, high seas or national spaces, and for species. And even within national jurisdictions, there are competing mandates and demands on natural resources and spaces. So this piecemeal, fragmented governance has proved to be really ineffective at protecting the ocean. And we need to transition to a more adaptive global response that takes account of the ocean as a commons. Some of these innovations that are happening in the ocean, to give you some examples, are the Belize Integrated Coastal Management Plan. This was such a successful policy that the UNESCO removed the Belize Reef from the World Heritage List in danger. In the shipping industry, ship recycling regulations by the IMO resulted in EU recycling regulations, which require all EU flagged ships now to be decommissioned in EU yards instead of being beached in Southeast Asia and dismantled manually at enormous environmental risk and human risk. A nice example of a local innovation is the Abelobi app. This allows the consumer to follow the story of the fish on their plate from the moment that the fish was caught to the time that to the place where it was caught, and even the story of the fisherman who caught it. So there are literally hundreds of these innovations happening in the ocean across policy spaces. And they all form incremental change, which is not necessarily less radical, but we are at a unique time in history. We can scale and accelerate these changes. We have science informing policy. We have a digital platform that could scale and share lessons quickly. We have the possibility of supporting a transition with governance and rights. So we could shift to a more holistic direction, which would protect the ocean as a commons. We identified 3 primary levers for the shift in governance. The first is to reconfigure traditional nation-state governance. The second is to empower the commons. And the third is to make ownership generative. I'll explain each of these in a little more detail. Firstly, reconfiguring nation-state governance. Current governance structures are incredibly rigid and slow and cumbersome. It takes years to pass new legislation, and at the UN level, sometimes decades. We've realized from COVID that that kind of law is just too slow and cumbersome. We need law that is responsive and reflexive and iterative, that can evolve as lessons are learned. We also need nested scales of governance, which is also called polycentric governance. This is where you have multiple scales of governance acting in a decentralized way and decisions are made together. So, for example, in Belize, there was a bottom-up participation of the local community, and they shared the lessons they were learning and what was working for them. And this was supported by a top-down vision by the government to create a sustainable blue economy and also to secure livelihoods. And the combination of these multiple scales of governance was really effective. The third element is meta-governance. If we think about the transition that lies ahead of us, it can be compared to a scale of transition from an industrial society, from an agrarian society to an industrial society. It's going to involve a balancing of objectives, social, economic, and environmental. So we suggest that some form of supranational body would be really helpful to articulate a shared vision for the future of the ocean and to create principled, flexible frameworks that can provide nations with a systemic governance that's more able to respond to system changes. So if we look at these 3 elements, local tuning through polycentric governance, translated into transformative, flexible governance, this could be governed and directed through a shared vision and facilitate a transition in ocean governance. The second element is to empower the commons. So this relates to all of us as individuals. How do we have a right to what's happening in our ocean? How do we know what's happening in the ocean? What sustainable practices are happening? One of the elements that we suggest is the recognition of a universal human right to the environment. Some constitutions do include a constitutional right to the environment, but an international recognition of a human right would facilitate a paradigm shift towards holistic, environmental governance. And the second element, which is really important, is to create a knowledge commons, a kind of Wikipedia for the ocean. There's so much information on the ocean that's available. There is data, but none of it is readily accessible to the average person, and it's not packaged or collated in a way that's really useful to guide policy. So if we could use this peer-to-peer economy and scale these local lessons to a planetary level, then we can leapfrog in this transition. We can move forward from lessons already learned and move forward in the transition. And the third and final element is to make ownership generative. And by this I mean forms of ownership that involve responsibility and have an outcome which is for the common good. So for example, if you think of a fisherman who has rights to fish a particular fish stock, he needs to exercise, or a fisherman or fisherwoman needs to exercise those rights in a way that is sustainable so that the stock is not depleted. So the way that to do this is to integrate rights with responsibilities. And this is already happening in the ocean space. For example, through certification, like the Marine Stewardship Council has a certification system which rewards sustainable fisheries and ensures transparency in the supply chain. So if you buy a fish with an MSC stamp, you know that the fish has been through a sustainable process of fishing and transparent supply chain. User and property rights have been really effective. For example, in Chile, the territorial user rights have allocated rights to certain fisher people in areas, and they collaboration on the fish stocks and the amount of fishing that is done by different communities. And this has led to very sustainable fishing in this area. And the final element is through industry initiatives. Business has a really important role to play in shaping an agenda for a new ocean. Corporations have incredible power, and some corporations have already come together. For example, CBOS is a collaboration of 10 of the biggest fishery companies in the world, and they have collaborated and to ensure that there are elements of transparency and to shepherd their processes to ensure a sustainable ocean. So if we combine all of these elements and we look at the transition ahead, we need governance that can reflect this unity, but this also the simultaneous complexity of the ocean system. And we can support the transitions that are already underway through these niche innovations. If we create a shared vision for the kind of ocean that we want, if we incorporate knowledge with institutional capacity, if we learn from the lessons that have already been learned, if we ensure inclusivity through polycentric governance, and ensure climate justice and environmental justice through rights, and if we integrate ownership with responsibility, then in conjunction, we can reconfigure governance and redefine our relationship with the ocean. I'm going to hand over to Mark to chat. I'm going to keep my screen on for Mark.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Tanya, for that succinct summary of an extremely complex line of argument, theoretical synthesis, and empirical integration, which can be found in the report itself, and to some extent, in summary form, in the article published in Nature. What I want to just do is talk about what we try to conceptualize as the ocean commons, and but to preface that by saying that what transition theory in its various manifestations tries to do is go beyond the traditional way of understanding the crises we face. So the traditional way of understanding the crises we face is to repeatedly emphasize how serious they are, and to repeatedly emphasize the need for transformation, which one cannot disagree with if you understand the problem. But very little is said about the trajectories of change, exactly what needs to happen when you wake up the next day. after you have completely agreed that we have a fundamental major crisis and we need some fundamental transformation. What do you do the next day? And transition theory really attempts to answer that question by identifying a multiple set of dynamics at the niche level, at the kind of regime level, at global landscape level, that interact in complex ways to give rise to shifts that we don't always fully understand, but manifest themselves at key moments, at key shifts, at key points of crisis. So in the spirit, and that really gives rise to the understanding that incrementalism is not necessarily a limp-wristed reformist response to crisis. It can potentially be a strong response if you join the dots, if you identify the multiple points of change and start linking them together in order to understand what may be changing under your feet, above your head, behind your back, in ways that are not always clearly apparent because of the lenses that we see things through. So it's in the spirit of that way of thinking about change in complex systems that we suggested that one of the things that needs to be recognized is the ocean is probably our most, one of our biggest commons. It's not just a resource commons, it is also potentially a knowledge commons. And so how do you bring the resource and the knowledge commons together in a designed system which connects bottom-up, crowdsourced data and information and initiatives with top-down integration of a multiplicity of research initiatives to create a knowledge commons that everybody can draw down on to fast track and accelerate a multiplicity of initiatives at the local level, but also for those governments that want to act and do something, to also access and have real-time access to system changes, policy frameworks, technical solutions that could be applied at a national government level. So this is not just a Wikipedia for the oceans. It's an interactive, global, local knowledge commons where collaborations from across the world are incentivized to build a knowledge core that is dependent on a configuration of an open source IT system. So here, this is the simple rendition of what that would look like. And why we put it forward is we want to get away from the assumption that the only way in which we're going to address the challenges that the ocean faces cannot simply be the establishment of a new global authority, because that really feeds on a traditional Westphalian conception that unless you have a state system to police the implementation of an agreed body of law, you're not going to be able to change a system. With the rise of information technology, there's a whole new set of actors that are empowered, self-managed mass communications, self-managed mass collaborations at a global level, which were not really possible before. And how do we harness that capacity in a way that reinforces whatever agreement may be reached at a global level to set up a new global governance system? So that's really trying to just, in a nutshell, trying to capture what a key part of our recommendation, and it was a pretty hard one to argue for because it is pretty much unconventional within the international community of engagement where these kinds of discussions take place. Thanks. Let me hand over to Philile.
Thank you. Oh, oh, okay, there we go. Okay. All right, so I'm just going to wrap up about, and I'm going to highlight some of the points that have been raised by Mark and Tanya, and particularly Tanya's earlier points about the ocean being a complex environment, and even coast as well. So there's a lot of complexity and a lot of diversity and plurality that is embedded within ocean and coastal environments that make them very difficult when it comes to issues of governability. And also, some of the time when you have a lot of government departments or a lot of governance actors that are basically that have a stake in the governance of the oceans and coastal environments, that could actually act as a blockage if governance processes are not well constructed and if they don't speak to or acknowledge the issue of complexity. So we found that that's quite an important thing to highlight. And therefore, I'm going to speak a little bit about issues of governance that we need to focus on if we want to improve this relationship between people and the oceans. So I'm going to start off by talking about governance interactions. So governance interactions are quite important because having a governance process or a governance process or practice is not enough if the interactions between different actors or stakeholders are not of good quality. So as Tanya has spoken, that most of the time governance actors work in silos, and that has negative implication on governance processes. So interactions are key when we're dealing with complex systems like oceans and coasts. Okay. So this is something that is also highlighted in other literature. So this is not from our paper, but it comes from Eleanor Ostrom's paper, where she highlights that interactions in any complex socio-ecological system are important. And oceans and coasts are not just complex socio-ecological systems. They are also political in as much they are also economic systems. So sometimes we miss that as well. So the interactions and the quality of them influences the outcomes that we get from governance processes. So interactions occur between resource units, resource systems, governance systems, as well as users. So if the quality of those interactions is not good enough, then the outcomes of governance will be negatively affected, which is what we do not want for sustainability. And it's also important to acknowledge that there are multiple perceptions and worldviews that different people hold towards the ocean. So the ocean means different things to different people. So if you are a director of environmental affairs, or if you are a fisherman or a fisherwoman in a village somewhere, let's say, I'm just going to say randomly in the Eastern Cape, or if you are an academic, or if you are someone that is going on tourism to visit the ocean will mean different things depending on who you are. So this is also an important thing to be mindful of, because people have different perceptions which inform how they interact with the oceans. So in governance processes, these perceptions need to be accommodated and recognized. So this diagram that you see here is from Lafebvre's special triad, which basically talks about how social space, and in relation to this work, we are talking about the ocean, how social space can differ depending on who's basically involved. So he talks about lived space, which is how people who live within a space perceive the area. So people who live along the ocean and who totally depend on the ocean for their livelihoods and well-being have a certain relationship with the ocean. And then people who are responsible for governing or managing access to the ocean and its resources have also a different relationship to the ocean that can be called conceived space in this diagram. And then people who interact with the ocean, let's say for recreation or tourism, have a certain sort of relationship with the ocean that is perceived space. So the lack of recognition of all these different types of perceptions and worldviews and meanings that people attach to the ocean can also act as a blockage towards governance processes, because a lot of times there are certain views that dominate governance processes and practices that are adopted all over the world to govern the ocean. So it's important to be mindful of this. And using South Africa as an example, it's also important when we're talking about governance to be mindful of context. So for instance, in South Africa, when we're talking about ocean governance, we cannot just talk about governance issues now. So most of the times when people talk about governance, they look at what's happening now, what's working, what's not working, what processes and practices we have in place, but seldomly do people take into account how history has informed what we know about governance and how we govern. So, for instance, in South Africa, most of you would know that during colonial and apartheid eras, many indigenous people along the coast were denied access to the ocean and coast. They were seen as illegal harvesters and so on. And only in the democratic dispensation has everyone been allowed to be able to interact with the ocean freely. So we cannot, therefore, do away with the fact that there's a lot of redress that needs to be done in terms of improving how those people are able to interact or access the ocean. So that's an important component that needs to be taken into account over and above the ones that have been mentioned when we're talking about ocean governance. And also, in this slide is just basically to highlight how complex ocean or coastal systems can be. So this is a map of South Africa and basically just highlighting the coastline. And so those of you who would have traveled the coastline of South Africa would know, for instance, that if you are in the Western Cape, let's say maybe Langebaan, or if you are in the Eastern Cape, let's say Mkambati or Dosachwebe, the nature of the coastline, the people that live in those coastlines, even the uses of the oceans and the sectoral activities, whether it be mining or fisheries or conservation, looks very different depending on where you are, even though it's the same country. So we cannot have a blanket approach to governance, even if we're dealing with one nation state like South Africa. So we have to be mindful of issues of context in order to make sure that we are able to cover, in order to make sure that governance caters for different contexts and different situations. And then lastly, I just also wanted to highlight that governance itself is a very complex process, because when we govern, we usually think of statutory governance. So a lot of our policies and laws that we use to govern the oceans and the coast come from statutory laws. But in a lot of places around the world, especially in the global south, and South Africa is one example, there are other forms of governance that are in place at the local level. For instance, customary or traditional forms of governance that actually operate parallel to statutory forms of governance. So without recognition of this plurality of governance systems that we may find in certain contexts, we might actually miss the point in governance. So for instance, a lot of indigenous people that live along the coast, not a lot of them, in some contexts, they draw on customary processes and practices and even institutions to govern how they interact with the coast. And usually these are undermined by statutory governance processes and practices. But in fact, they need to work together, because there's a lot that can be gained from drawing on different sets of knowledges, and also acknowledging that the ways of knowing about the ocean can be diverse. They don't only come from natural science. They can come from social science. They can come from indigenous knowledge systems and so on. So those need to be taken into account so that we can have cohesive governance processes. And just in conclusion, these are just, in the paper, we do talk about environmental and social justice quite a little bit. And these are some of the key points that I wanted to highlight in relation to that it's important for us to protect the oceans. It's important to be mindful of green and blue grabbing activities that are happening and try to basically act against those processes. Like I mentioned earlier in my research, I'm working on looking at the critical perspectives of the blue economy and how basically those processes can actually negate some of these governance efforts that are being made. And issues of redress and restorative justice are also important, where governance processes historically have undermined certain people from their rights of access to ocean resources. So we need to make sure governance processes now address those issues. We also need to acknowledge and embrace the fact that governing the oceans involves plural institutions, plural actors, and we need to figure out how to deal with that. And like Tanya was talking about nestedness, it's an important thing, and it's something that we cannot run away from, the fact that there's so much plurality. So there needs to be nestedness and communication between different sectors and actors at different levels. then, I've spoken about institutions, and decentralization is also important. So the whole reason why we have governance is because we've shifted away from government and recognizing that governments are not enough to help us govern complex environments such as the coast. So multiple actors are needed, such as civil society, the private sector, and so on. And we've seen that Abalobi in South Africa is also doing great work in helping fisheries governments manage small-scale fisheries, for instance. So we need to encourage the use of different knowledge systems so that we can improve governance, the governance of the oceans. And then I would just like to acknowledge all the other authors, as Tanya did in the beginning. And so in this publication, we had a whole suite of authors, so Mark and Tanya, and then there's also Mary and Eddie, Henrik, Stefan, and myself. So we are very grateful to have this opportunity to sort of expand on some of the issues that are discussed in the paper in this presentation. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you to our three presenters for giving that summary of the work that you've done. And just to say, it's amazing to just to see what you've brought together. So it's about, if I had to summarize that just very briefly, I would say it was the contribution that you're making is to give a different conceptual framing about how we speak about natural resources such as the ocean by saying that it's complex. Often policymakers put these little boundary over these things and they put it in a little box as if it's untouchable. And that if we just look at that thing and we try and solve it by itself, that we can have some kind of framing for that. And you've opened up that box and you've broadened that up quite a lot. And I've also experienced that in the work that I've done on complexities, that the first engagement ever that I've had with sustainability or sustainability scientists, apart from Mark, were people working with ocean governance that came to speak with us and asked us, what is this thing about complexity? Because we're trying to solve problems around small fisheries or estuary management. It seems that, this is complex. What can we do here? So it seems that problem is, not just the local context that people are having, challenges, but that it's now like you've placed it now on the global scale also. And that's amazing. And you've also reconfigured the notion of governance, and you've reconfigured, or you've given a different alternative definition for what transition means. So you've basically touched on those three different, which are sort of conceptual theoretical fields. You've sort of expanded those to bring in the complexity and sustainable transitions governance into that, and I think that is quite new for this space of ocean governance. So thank you very much for that. I see that in our chat box we have really interesting questions, and I'd like to let us go to answer one or two of those questions. But what I also would like to do maybe, and this is without warning and without precedent at this stage, is maybe also to give some of the people who are attending, because there are some interesting people in the audience that are also working in the field quite closely, to maybe just respond by voice. Mark, Philile, Tanya, would you be okay with that if I ask some people to maybe just put up their hands and we hear their voice, or just maybe to respond, maybe not to ask questions, but maybe also just to respond from their perspective in the fields that they are working, how this has been received, or if they have an initial response to, what is a welcome contribution that this paper is bringing, or this framing. Yes. Rather than engaging with a theoretical academic kind of exchange, but maybe to see if participants were maybe willing to just share, how in your field is this work, or is this being responded to? That'd be great. So how you do that is you actually just show your hand, you press on a little button next to your name and you show your hand, and I can see it. So I can, for example, see that Jan would like to make a contribution. So I'm going to put Jan on, and then I'm going to look through the chat box again, and maybe just after Jan, take one or two of the questions in the chat box. Is that okay?
That'd be great.
Great. Jan, I'm going to try and let you talk. Hang on. Allow to talk. Right, let's see if that works. Yeah, Jan, you can unmute yourself.
Hello, Jan.
We can't see you, but you can talk. No, we can't hear you for some reason. Okay, I'm going to take, whilst we give Jan maybe a chance to check his setup, one or two of the questions. Desta was asking, how do you define the boundary of an ocean system? We've been struggling with that for a number of years. And in the same vein, if you're looking at how do we define the boundary, how do you restructure existing international organizations to actually span those spaces that we put out to be, those spaces that we say they are? And I pose that to any of the participants.
Mark, would you like to answer?
Yeah. It may well be possible to reform existing governance institutions, and there are negotiations underway in that regard, in particular with respect to the high seas, which is an area, as one of the comments reflects, is not governed. And that is opening up the high seas to high levels of exploitation, especially new mining projects of the ocean bed. So yes, it's definitely one of the options to look at how you reform global governance, existing global governance institutions. But there may be a build-up of pressures and a coalition of interests who start to question whether that's going to be fast enough. And so I think it is necessary to put in place a body of law and precedent, which is what Tanya has done, that could justify, and also looking at other precedents like Man and Biosphere Reserve, the Arctic governance systems, various others, as precedents where you could imagine a new alternative super governance arrangement. However, if that is conceived of in the traditional way, decoupled from the new capabilities that we as humans have as a result of the information technology revolution, that would be unfortunate. We really do have a set of new capabilities. So if you look at large institutions like, or large institutional configurations like Mozilla, Linux, Wikipedia, but also at the local levels, the maker spaces, the fab labs, the proliferation of the new blockchain systems, the new cooperative systems that are mushrooming, and alternative currencies. There's plenty of empirical evidence that we are evolving capabilities for modes of governance that could be more inclusive, and because of the way information is used, could reinforce social and environmental justice. So I think we just need to, in a sense, broaden our repertoire of institutional reform and transformation, and in light of the rapidity of changes and the new capabilities that we have, and the fact that the ocean is a commons. Yes, there are boundary challenges on exactly what one means, but we also just know what it means. We've lived with the ocean our entire history of a species as a species.
Thanks, Mark. One or two more interesting questions in the chat box. Maybe there's one by Wilmien Wycombe. Is South Africa's Fisheries Authority, the responsible department, open to engaging on this kind of approach? Have they been engaged? But before we answer that, maybe we listen to see if we can get Jan Jan to talk. I've upgraded him. Jan, are you there? Jan? Ah, seems your sound is not working somehow. You'd have to maybe type. You've got a sound bug on your side. Sorry about that. Any one of you, Tanya, Philile, has the South African Fisheries Authority been engaged with you on this?
Okay, I can try and speak to that, but I wasn't sure. I saw Vilmeen's question, but I wasn't sure when she meant approach, this kind of approach, what it means. So I'm not sure if she's able to type, but I can just basically say that there is a relationship with, for instance, us at UCT who are working on issues of marine and fisheries governance. We are engaged with civil society and the government, including the fisheries department. We do try to engage with them. But it's obviously not easy because in as much, I think when I made an earlier point that in as much as ocean or coastal systems are seen as social or ecological system, there are other factors that are at play, such as economic and political factors that are very difficult to try and understand. So sometimes when these engagements do open, there are sometimes points where there's not enough understanding of where each person is coming from. So for instance, even with academics, between natural sciences and social sciences, there's still sort of a disconnect in terms of, what informs our understanding about what governance of fisheries should look like. So with the governments, we have tried to engage with them, but it's not always as simple as one hopes it would be, because we work a lot with communities on the ground, and we don't try to act as a voice of the communities, but we just try our best to present in decision-making platforms where we have access what's coming from the ground. But that's not always received in the way that we hope it will receive, because there are just so many other factors that are at play. But I would say that the government is probably aware, but to what extent I cannot really say. But I think it's just a work in progress. I mean, we just have to keep trying to communicate with everyone that should be involved and not just communities. I'm not sure if Tanya wants to add to that.
I would like to just add that the solutions aren't always going to be through the traditional lens that we've always looked at these problems. And there are other ways, as Mark was saying as well. So, for example, the FAO has developed a series of guidelines to guide fisheries in the high seas and to guide deep sea fishing. So they've created principled frameworks that can be implemented in national legislation, and they're based on the agreed principles and provide a degree of flexibility to national governance to implement these sustainable principles, but to guide the way that we use the oceans. So these kind of new interventions or innovations are also really happening at the moment and can make a huge difference in the way that we interact on different governance levels, as Philile was saying. I think Jan has joined us.
Yes.
Hi.
I am now here.
Great.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Fine, and we can see you as well.
Okay, so you can hear me. I'm now just changed from my laptop, which has a microphone problem.
Perfect.
And I'm now on my iPad. So thank you. It's a wonderful discussion so far. A lot of what has been said and going forward can be tied up to the United Nations Law of the Sea Convention. It has been dubbed as the Constitution of the Ocean. Virtually every, including landlocked states, virtually every state in the world is members, and they have different parts. I mean, fisheries, marine pollution, and what instigated the negotiation of that convention in the 1970s was the ambassador of Malta to the United Nations started when different countries were starting to claim the seabed, starting to make claims on the seabed. He stood up in the United Nations General Assembly. His name was Arvid Pardo, and he said that the ocean floor and all the resources below it are the common heritage of mankind, which is a kind of echo of a common space. So if you were to start putting what is in effect here, they meet obviously every year, the different sectors, the fishery sector, the pollution sector, it governs boundaries, which somebody mentioned. I would start contacting the South African delegation or your country's delegation that goes to these and revisit these things. So it's a long political process, but I'm sure you'd find a lot of goodwill. And regarding the question of boundaries, we must distinguish very clearly between ecosystem boundaries and man-made or zones, maritime zones. So we have a 12 nautical mile territorial sea, we have a 200 nautical mile exclusive fishing zone, but the ecosystem boundaries have been recognized in some conventions, like the Convention on governing. It's called the Camelot, the Convention on the Antarctic Marine Living Resources, Camelot. The boundary of that is the Antarctic Convergence, which is where the cold waters coming from the Antarctic meet the warmer waters coming south. So it's not a straight line like these other man-made boundaries. It's a squiggly line around the Antarctic continent. So it's time to start thinking that way. My last comment, also that needs some exploration, is a kind of a new concept which has come, to best of my knowledge, in the last decade, which is so-called marine spatial planning. It's a bit of I don't know much about it, but it's certainly been taken seriously in the European countries and elsewhere in the world. So marine spatial planning, I think, tries to look at some of what you guys are trying to achieve, is a more integrated approach to ocean management and governance. So lots to think about. That's my tuppence worth so far.
Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us on that as well, Jan. We've had connected to that. I see. How do we not only sort of engage the state or governance organizations, but also it seems that we also have to sort of include citizenry, and hence the need for some global ocean literacy. How does that need link up with, and I'll try and combine that with a question from Russell Stevens that says that, please, can the concept of the ocean communications be unpacked more, i.e. beyond the wiki information, to increase awareness and consciousness of global ocean understandings? Is that what you're trying to suggest in this paper as well? Or how do you envisage the role of citizens, the public, in relation to this new kind of governance, or like you said, adaptive responsive governance framework? Mark?
Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, so, I mean, everybody understands what is meant when one refers to an information clearinghouse like Wikipedia. And we're kind of a bit stuck in that paradigm. We need to go beyond that. So yes, completely. You need to fundamentally change the communication information flows in a way that ensures greater access and empowers and potentially empowers a whole range of people. But information on its own and information flows on its own is not sufficient. Hence the emphasis on a greater level of and creating a platform for greater levels of collaborations. So you can have multiple kinds of collaborations. You can have collaborations between innovation spaces like the Belize example that we gave, and many similar ones like the ones that Philile is talking about around the world. Fisher communities, coastal communities, island communities, whatever it is, trying to collect knowledge and share knowledge in ways that in real time allows one to build a knowledge commons and then download from that in order to reinforce what is happening. But the same can happen. Same kind of sharing can happen between nations, and nations can also access what is happening through innovations at a local level, but you can also do that at a global level. So we can now operate, have small group dynamics at a global level because we have the resources now to collaborate. So I think we need to tap into the kind of thinking that is emerging, for example, from a publication like the Commons Manifesto, edited by Bowens and others, work coming out of the P2P Foundation in Europe. And although they've never really applied that in the ocean context, it has great relevance when you're basically bringing together knowledge commons type thinking and related technologies with the Ostrom type resource commons. The Ostrom paradigm on its own is also not sufficiently sensitive to what is possible if you start bringing these two resource and knowledge commons paradigms together and building appropriate institutions to empower action.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Tanya, did you want to add to that? Or?
Maybe just to say that some of the new governance is evolving to take into account the involvement of civil society. We've seen that in the Paris Agreement. It specifically makes provision for civil society to participate, and that's where an environmental right is really useful. If you have a right to have standing in court, you can have a voice to represent a community or to represent a part of some resource that's being challenged. And we had that recently in South Africa, which was in the World WWF case, where they brought the fisheries department to court to challenge their quotas. And it was the first time in our history, in our legislative history and juridical history, that has happened. And it's really exciting that civil society is starting to be recognized as a voice and can contribute. And this is also in the biodiversity negotiations under the United Nations Convention, also makes space for the role of civil society. And I think that's really important. And also the role of business. Business is a really important player now on the international governance stage.
Great. I see the questions are coming in and they are wide-ranging. We unfortunately have to stop soon. But just to say, I can also just see there's some people are trying to make some connections between the atmosphere that is also kind of a boundless space with no borders. Have people made sort of connections between studying how oceans as a commons and the atmosphere as a commons is being governed or understood or managed? I think we don't have time to answer these. And then there's sort of the idea also of how is traditional knowledge on the oceans in South Africa being included in your work. Maybe, Philile, if there's some text that you could maybe just, or some, maybe just, would you like to maybe just quickly answer that one? Because I think there's, that would be really interesting to just share some resources with people if there's some work on that, where they can go and have a look at that. Or if you want to type your website or your details or your email in the chat box, that'd be great.
Okay, I can definitely do that. But I think I'll just say this in response to this, but even to the previous points, that it's also about the co-production of knowledge when it comes to the ocean. Because I think even at the international level, like with the United Nations conventions, there is a lot of discourse and narrative about participation and about including civil society and other actors in the governance, whether you're talking about fisheries, whether you're talking about the CBD and so on. But the problem is that doesn't usually translate in what happens in individual countries when governments draft their policy and legislation. And even if it's embedded in that, when it comes to institutions, basically, that implements governance processes and practices, sometimes that also gets lost in the way. So I think at all levels of governance, the issue of co-production is important. So of recognizing different ways of knowing about the ocean and different types of knowledge, just like traditional knowledge. Because, I mean, a lot of my work points to the fact that a lot of the knowledge that is used to basically inform how we govern fisheries, for instance, is usually natural science knowledge. There's still very little evidence where customary or traditional knowledge systems are being included. I mean, in a lot of areas where I work with, people are always asking, we do want to work with the governments, we do care about conservation of oceans and marine resources, but we don't understand why there are no platforms being put forward to allow us to participate in decision-making processes. So also, even if it's, I'm looking at the chat, some people are talking about issues of power. So power is a very central thing in governance that is rarely spoken about even in the literature or even in governance processes and practices. But ultimately, power defines who gets to basically dominate processes and practices of governance. For instance, if you look at the blue economy, a lot of the narrative there is around the neoliberal value or the capitalist, sort of the monetary value of the ocean, rather than its other values that are important, such as the social and other types of values. So I think if we focus on either the economic or the ecological and not the social or political or everything holistically, we might miss the point when it comes to promoting a sustainable form of governance. So yeah, I know I sort of covered a whole lot of points, but I just wanted to touch a little bit on that.
Thank you so much, Philile, for that answer. I'm going to ask you, Philile, maybe if you would like to just put your details in the chat box, people can connect with you. And then also just to say, I see in the chat box and in the Q&A box, some people have been quite active in giving answers or answering some of the questions. Jessica from WWF, thank you very much for sharing there. Peter also, thank you for answering questions to some of the answers. This is what I like about this new webinar format, is that you have a bunch of people together and we can sort of learn from each other and share from each other whilst chatting on the side and talking. Mark, there was just one last question about what is a seminal text for transitions. Maybe you'd like to just type that up in the chat box if you'd like to. And then I'll keep the chat box a little bit open for whether people would like to just share email addresses or just try and connect in a way before I close the room. But I think if there's anyone that would like to have a last word between Tanya, Jan, Philile, Mark, in closing. Tanya?
I just want to say thank you so much for this collaboration. It's been really interesting to hear everybody's perspectives, and it just reinforces for me the importance of cross-disciplinary work when we're talking about these big picture problems. We need social scientists, lawyers, environmental scientists. We all need to be talking to each other, and we need to find ways of really understanding each other's worlds so that we can find solutions that make a difference and actually are creative and reimagine our solutions for the future. So it's been really great. Thank you.
Great. Thank everyone for sharing and being part of today's webinar. We have recorded this session and we'll be posting this to the CST website. There's a special tab for lockdown webinars, is what we call it, and we'll probably be up and running from next week if you'd like to rewatch or share. Thank you very much, and wish you a great day further. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Rika. Great
Thank you so much.
Very much. Thanks, Peileen.